Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyle Renner. I manage the Institute for International Economic Policy here at the George Washington University. And on behalf of the conference organizers and our sponsors, it's my pleasure to welcome you again to our conference on digital trade. It's our pleasure to have today as our Luncheon Keynote Susan Lund, who is partner at the McKinsey Global Institute and an economist by trade. Susan will be presenting her keynote. If you are participating online, please do use #DigitalTradeConf to tweet your questions for the Q&A session. Otherwise, without further ado, please welcome Susan Lund to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I know many of you and hope to meet the rest of you here today. I'm going to step back. We all know why we're here, digital trade. I'm going to share with you the highlights of a report that we released just a few months ago on the topic that really illustrate and bring to life how big it is, how fast it's changing, and why it's so important to countries and individuals and businesses to get this right. This truly is a frontier, and all of the topics on the agenda today around how do we start to think about trade agreements and policies around this set of issues and what do developing economies need to do to get into this game are incredibly important. So I have until 2 o'clock. I'm going to go through the highlights of the report. There were copies outside. I'll go through it very quickly and then open it up to question and answer. Anyone who didn't get copies, I think they're gone, but would like them, feel free to reach out to me. We're happy to share. You can also download from the website. So our report, Digital Globalization, what's happening? So we start in this report by looking at all forms of economic interconnections between countries. So that's trade in goods, in services, flows of finance, immigration of people, and then cross-border data flows. And there are a couple striking things that we found about the way globalization and the interconnectedness of economies is evolving. The first is that since 2007, there has been a dramatic slowdown. This chart shows you the value of trade in goods, services, and finance from 1980 right up to the present, and you see that in essence, global trade grew about twice as fast as global GDP from about 1990 up through 2007. And then after the Great Recession, there was a predictable crash, but what's happened since then is not a recovery, but a plateau. And now we're 5 years on, where global trade in goods in particular has been more or less flat, and it's actually declining as a share of world GDP. So there is a lot of commentary and questions around, is this nationalism and protectionism? Is the era of globalization over? Certainly in the US, in the middle of a presidential campaign, we're hearing a lot of trade bashing and some of the fallout of earlier trade agreements. So are we at the end of an era? Well, the first thing we looked at is why has the trade in goods stalled? We broke this down into the overall figure, which is on your which is flattened, and then the different components. So on the left, you'll see trade in commodities and raw materials and process, like steel. That's down. Not surprising because of the price of commodities is very low. The slowdown in China means that there's less exports and imports of hard minerals and oil. But when you look over to the right, you'll see both intermediate inputs and global trade in finished goods are both flat and down relative to GDP. So what's happening here? Well, we think that there are two factors. One certainly is that part of this is a cyclical downturn because you've got very weak growth in China, because Europe has been growing very anemically, you've got low growth in Japan, the US isn't where we'd like to see it. All of this means that, to some degree, it's not a surprise that global trade in goods is down. But we think that there's also a structural component to this. When we work with companies across the country and around the world, a couple things are changing. One is the development of global supply chains and value chains. So the last 20, 25-year period was extraordinary because China really entered the global economy, as did other emerging markets. And during this period, global supply chains developed into very complex long beats. That has more or less reached a limit, and in many cases, supply chains are actually shortening and can consolidating. That explains part of the decline in the trade in intermediate goods. For finished goods, we see that there's more production where the consumption is, where the consumers are. Now, some of those consumers are in China and other developing economies, and so goods that are produced there are consumed there. But there's also a bit of production going on where it's shifting back to markets like Europe, like the US, where labor is no longer a primary factor in considering where to produce most types of manufactured goods. Apparel, textiles, shoes would be exceptions, but for the majority of manufactured goods, labor costs are no longer the decisive factor, and so that favors countries that have good infrastructure, law and copyright, etc. When we look forward, we can see how the impact of technology could take another bite out of global trade in goods, and that's 3D printing or additive manufacturing. So right now, over the last 5 to 10 years, the technologies have improved, the costs have been coming down. We don't think that explains any of the decline in global trade yet, but if you think about what could happen over the next 10 years, there are different estimates out there on how much 3D printing could take a bite out of trade. So in essence, what we'll do is ship a design file around and then 3D print the good where it's consumed rather than mass producing the good and then trading it around the world. Now, this is never going to completely replace mass production, let's be very clear. But for replacement parts and for prototype goods, it actually has made a big difference. So there are examples already today. For instance, Maersk tankers, 3D printing replacement parts on its container ships. They're actually very worried about this slowdown in global trade, by the way. You've got U.S. Army and Navy 3D printing parts in the field where they're needed. Humanitarian and disaster relief organizations doing the same. So as we look forward, this will put another damper, likely, on the global trade in goods. So what does it mean? Is global trade in goods over? Certainly not. It's important, still the largest economic part of the trade, but it's very unlikely that it will continue to grow twice as fast as global GDP. And indeed, trade as a percent of GDP, may be flat for many years going forward. So what is taking its place? Well, this is why we're all here. We have now the growing connections in the world economy are no longer the physical flow of goods, but it is a flow of information and data. This chart shows you cross-border used bandwidth linking different regions of the world back in 2005. And the size of the bubbles on the chart is the amount of cross-border data flows within each region. So you can see just 10 years ago, the primary flow of digital information and digital trade was between the US and EU. Now, fast forward just 10 years, and this is a picture of the map. So the intra-regional flow of data has exploded. More regions of the world are connected. Cisco projects that the total value of cross-border data flows is going to increase 9 more times over the next 5 years. It was a 45-fold increase from 2005 to 2015. So increasingly, the internet and all forms of data flows are now the connective tissue of the global economy. So globalization, rather than being over, is in some level just beginning. It's just a different era of globalization. These cross-border data flows encompass everything. It's person-to-person communication, it's Google search, it's intra-company data sharing, it's business-to-business data files, you name it. We wish we could disaggregate what those bits and bytes are, but we can't. But we do have some sense of what this is. So first we can look at how do digital data flows underpin traditional types of trade. So in the trade in goods, cross-border e-commerce is already worth 12% of global trades in goods. That's astounding when you think about cross-border e-commerce, ordering stuff over the internet. The value of those goods shipped is already 12% global trade in goods. Services, digitally delivered services, are about 50% of all services trade worldwide. We look at calls. Skype alone is 46% of international call minutes. Now takes place over Skype, computer to computer. So in the report, we look at what are the different ways that digital technologies are changing how we think about global connectivity as well as trade. And the first big change is that we now have online platforms like Facebook or eBay or Upwork, Coursera, Kickstarter that enable any two parties anywhere in the world to use this platform at low or almost no cost and connect. This is tremendous because it opens a door to globalization and global trade to small businesses, startups, and even individuals now can be global. Trade used to be about huge multinational corporations sending container ship loads of goods around. Today, it's happening at a much smaller level. It's more, on one level, democratized, and it's open to many small flows as opposed to just very large transactions. On the right, you see just the size and users of the largest of these digital platforms, which is astonishing. Facebook, which is a platform that barely existed 10 years ago. If it were a nation, it would now be the largest country on earth. YouTube, WhatsApp, WeChat, and Alibaba are all larger than the US in terms of population, and you can go down the list and so on. So this is probably the most important change that digital technologies have brought about in globalization. But they've also created digital goods. There are now a range of goods that used to be physical items that are now mainly digital, and that means they can be transmitted around the world instantaneously at low to almost no cost. So movies, games, books would be examples. As you think about the future, think about 3D printing. So for those of you with young children and possibly playrooms full of Legos, imagine a future where what you do is download a design file from Lego and then you print your Lego set on your 3D home printer. Sounds crazy, but for those of you who make the trip out to Rockville Pike to buy that stuff, you will welcome such a future. And then we have digital wrappers. The most, I think, easy to understand concept here would be radio frequency tags. So now you apply a digital technology to a physical shipment of goods, and it does a couple things. First, it allows you to track that shipment of goods. So it's reduced for many companies the value of goods lost in transit by 50 to 70%. And it also enables you to transact more valuable goods because A, you can insure them because they're tracked, and then you know where they are. So these are the three main ways that we see digital technologies transforming traditional trade in goods and services. And then, of course, underlying it all is just the pure communication component. It's hard to imagine a single trade deal anywhere in the world that takes place without an email, without VoIP or digital phone call along the way. So all of this is going to get bigger, and it's going to pose big challenges for policymakers and for economists like myself. This chart shows you the projected increases in online cross-border shoppers. It's projected to rise to nearly 1 billion cross-border shoppers by 2020 that are going to spend nearly $1 trillion of goods. And this is only business to consumer. Business to business e-commerce is actually 4 to 5 times larger than this. So already if shipment of goods across borders by e-commerce is 12% of global trade, you can imagine it's going to be a larger and larger shipment. Now, this is tough as an economist because I think countries don't do a very good job at all of tracking this. Now the U.S. just raised a de minimis on the value of goods crossing borders that you have to pay taxes at customs on to $800. So you can go online and order up to $800 of goods from, say, a country in Europe, have it shipped to your house, and that's that. So it's a big challenge for how we even measure trade. And it, of course, then also poses real problems with customs and processing and being more efficient. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the big changes is that now small companies can participate in globalization, and this is creating new competition for the big guys and opening up new opportunities for the smaller guys. So Facebook, which most of you probably think of as a social media individual-to-individual connection, actually has 50 million small and medium-sized enterprises that advertise on Facebook, and they have fans, not friends, and currently 30% of their fans are cross-border. So this is a free instant marketing platform to 1.6 billion people around the world. Alibaba, the Chinese version of Amazon, and a bit like eBay, it has 10 million small businesses on it. Amazon Marketplace itself hosts 2 million small businesses. So this is opening up the door to globalization. Individuals are also participating. In this chart, we've looked at how do individuals participate in globalization. Well, 914 million of them have at least one cross-border friend on a social media platform like Facebook, or the Chinese version of Facebook or Twitter. So that's over 900 million unique individuals have at least one cross-border connection. Every year, of course, international travel is exploding for both business and tourism reasons. There are 429 million people cross borders. We've got 361 million people have purchased something online from another country in the last year. That's compared to only 244 million people living long-term in a country other than their country of birth, and so on down the line. So individuals suddenly are becoming more globally minded and have ways of being global without actually leaving home. In labor markets, where I do a lot of my research, this is interesting because it means that for many types of work can be done remotely through the internet, and you don't need to have long-term immigration. People moving to where the jobs are, the jobs can actually go find the people. It opens a lot of opportunity for folks with the right skills in developing countries. This chart gives you an example of the scale of that impact. So right now, just 1% of people living in the United States are of Indian descent. Yet Indians are 4% of the U.S. ICT sector, not surprising. And they're 22% of all the workers on Mechanical Turk, which is Amazon's task-oriented online demand labor platform. So this is on Mechanical Turk is an example of doing sort of virtual immigration. People can do the work without ever leaving home. So one of the main contributions of this report in our mind is to look at the economic contribution. We did months of very sophisticated econometrics that you can read about in the technical appendix to the report to look at a couple questions. First, do countries that are more open to all these flows, inflows and outflows, grow faster than others? And if so, how does it work? And we found, and I've now boiled it down to just one page and 3 numbers for you, but we conclude that, in fact, despite all the political rhetoric, that being open to inflows and outflows enhances GDP growth of a country. And that when we look over the last 10 years of the world economy, that cross-border transactions have added $7.8 trillion to the global GDP, conservatively speaking. That's about a 10% lift to if we lived in a world without those flows. Now, interestingly, we found that the cross-border data flow element is now the single most valuable component in terms of lifting growth. So at least $2.8 trillion of that impact comes from cross-border data flows alone. That's both the direct effects from the econometrics as well as the indirect effects in it enables trade in goods and services and so on. So that's a larger impact than trade in physical goods at this point. And that's amazing to us given that cross-border data flows, 10 years ago almost didn't exist, and we've been trading goods for, centuries. And then we look at, what's driving the impact? And what we find is that countries that are open increase their productivity. So the idea is openness to competition. Companies can get the best inputs, the best talent, the best ideas, and that this is about innovation and boosting productivity. This is not about developing a trade surplus and a mercantilist view of the world of let's export more. This is about the benefits of openness and interconnection and the flow of ideas, goods, services, and money. Now, all countries are not connected in the same way. We created what we call the MGI Global Connectedness Index, and in our most recent version, we rank 133 countries. This is just a small number of them that I've pulled out. And in general, advanced economies are more connected to the global economy than developing countries. So although we live in a world that's more interconnected than ever, more countries are participating, there's still big differences in how they participate. So Singapore tops the list this year. It has had a very explicit strategy around taking advantage of the global economy, given that it's a small country without natural resources, for at least 25 years. They started out as a port in shipment of physical goods and oil to Southeast Asia. Then they moved into being a regional financial hub and becoming a business service center for Southeast Asia. And they've been incredibly successful at this. You'll also see that they rank very high on people flows. They have very open immigration policy if you come with skills or money. And they rank very highly on cross-border data flows. The US and Germany are both, rank in the top 10 on every kind of flow. They are just broadly open economies. Now, surprisingly, when you look down the list, a couple things stand out. One is that China has jumped to number 7 this year, just based on its manufacturing strength and cross-border financial flows. When you look along the Nordics, you see Sweden jumps out with, again, very strong data flows. And then many of the large Asian exporters that I expected when we first created this to rank much higher are quite low. So Korea, Japan down at number 24, below Malaysia and Thailand. I think of Japan as maybe at the forefront of globalization. And yet, what this illustrates is that despite strength in trade, you look over to the right of the chart, cross-border flows of people and data are quite low in those economies. And so these are countries that have prospered under the last era of globalization around trade in goods and services, but are less well-positioned as we look forward. Now, despite the fact that lots more countries are connected, like I said, we think that there are about 9 countries that are far more connected than everyone else. So this chart shows you on the vertical axis, the height is how overall connected the country is. And on the horizontal axis, you have GDP per capita. So you have these 9 countries that are very connected, and then everyone else, regardless of income level, has got a lot more room to participate. So this is a way we believe that countries can, in fact, have more prosperity at home. There's big opportunities across the board to do more to participate in the global economy. So what does this mean for where we are? So to summarize, we've divided this somewhat simplistically, but I think this captures the essence of the shift that we're talking about. Globalization, last century, this century. Well, first, it used to be about the physical flow of goods, and now it's really about intangible flows of data information. It used to be mainly trade between advanced economies, the US, Europe, and Japan, and now you've got emerging economies are, for instance, in trade in goods, they're now 50% of the global trade in goods takes place with an emerging economy. It used to be mainly goods were capital intensive or labor intensive, but now we see that knowledge intensive flows are at the leading edge of globalization. So when you think about what countries had to do, it used to be building out your transportation infrastructure and logistics, which is still important, but increasingly as important is the digital infrastructure and the digital policies around ICT, around data privacy, flows of information are critically important, and those, as we all know, are sort of just entering the lexicon of global trade negotiations. It used to be that trade was really about very large multinational corporations setting up operations and pretty much being the conduit for the flows of goods, and now you've got a much larger role for small businesses, even individuals. Used to be the flows were mainly, you could count them in money, so this is how we value trade statistics. But increasingly with the internet, you've got exchanges that are free. Skype, Facebook, Twitter, e-commerce as a platform that's not charging consumers. Now, we know that these transactions create a lot of consumer value, but it's not captured in our GDP statistics, and certainly not in our trade statistics. And then finally, it used to be a world where ideas diffused relatively slowly across borders. So working with private sector companies like my firm does, it used to be that you could develop a new product, a new idea, and you would have a good period of time where that was your idea, and you could build a competitive advantage, and you would have market share, even without the patent system or anything like that. You could do that. Now, ideas are out there and competitors are out there reverse engineering your good on day one. There's no longer the chance to have a product launch in one country and then we'll go to the next country and next country. Instead, everything's global immediately. So this has really intensified competition for companies to stay on the leading edge. And then finally, it used to be that really innovation was done in the US, Europe, and Japan, and then ideas flowed out to developing countries. But increasingly in this complex global web, what we're seeing is that innovations that are developed for developing countries then are reversed back to the US. So great example would be GE developing a cardiograph machine for less than $1,000 to use in villages in India. And then they realized, wow, with the US healthcare cost crisis, this would be useful in the US as well. And so increasingly, innovation is flowing every which way, and it's no longer really a one-way flow from the north to the south. So for policymakers, that's what this entire conference is about. For countries, I think there's huge opportunity to think strategically about the role your country can play. I highlighted just a few on our connectedness index, but there are very interesting examples. Netherlands is number 2, the second most connected economy on our index in the world. They of course have the big data hubs and internet landing sites for Europe and have really built on that digital industry. And there was an opportunity for developing countries to think how they fit into this. But there are all sorts of policies and barriers that either hinder or threaten to hinder this free flow of data and information. It's clear that countries also need to get really serious about helping industries and workers that are dislocated by globalization. Even though in overall trade and globalization has raised global GDP, that's not to say everyone's a winner. And it's hard to point to any country around the world that has really seriously addressed the labor aspect of people who are dislocated from all of this. So issues of data privacy, cybersecurity are important, and that's what panels is over the last day and a half and next few hours will address. But overall, our take is that we are at the beginning of an exciting new era, a one filled with challenges, but a lot more opportunity for more people to get involved. And I would love to take questions or comments. Yes.
I'm sorry, who would you like?
Yeah, if you could state your name and where you're from.
Yeah, thanks for your great presentation. And I'm very pleased to see all those information and data and the flow of GDP and information. My question is, how much research or data that you have regarding the negative services or harmful product, like a lot of toxic chemicals that we want to get rid of, and a lot of this service that is like hacking, like a lot of fraud and crime, but they charge to employees' salaries and their bonuses. So do you have that type of information, and how are we going to deal with that?
It's true that look, there is an underbelly to all of this. In general, the flow of information is good and it's welfare enhancing, but along with this openness and transparency, you can have e-commerce and illicit goods through the dark web. You can have now cybercrime. And I just heard about in Kenya, which is a leading country in mobile money, there are now, guess what, digital loan sharks. So almost as fast as you have the benefit of a digital technology, it's true that it's opening up it enables both the good guys and the bad guys to use it, and it creates a lot of issues around enforcement and how do you capture this, and we don't have good answers. Unfortunately, along with the huge amounts of good that are transmitted digitally and come from open flow of information, there is an element of bad. And I think, it's interesting to figure out how we're going to deal in this world. But I think our view would be it's clear that good or bad, it is the way it is. Trying to cut yourself off from this or censor it or limit it is trying to swim against the tide, as we say.
So my name's Daniel Crosby, and I work with the law firm of King and Spalding in Geneva. And you're exactly your last point of trying to limit and censor and all this. I was going to ask about China, and are they swimming against the tide, and they're so big that they can do it? Or my question was, how do you see the system playing out where China takes advantage of the global system, but not everyone who thinks they should be operating in China can go there, and how do you seek a balance in that system of competition where we think everything's open, but sometimes it's not?
It's a real challenge. I think that censorship and trying to limit the flow of information is quite difficult in this age, and I think it is, in some sense, swimming against the tide. It has enabled China to develop its own homegrown platforms, Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi, etc. So they have they do have a free flow of information within the country, but yeah, the Great Firewall of China is an issue, and of course, it hampers businesses for sure, trying to do business, and it is, I don't want to comment on the social consequences of this as well, but it's an issue, and it certainly is, I think, flies against the trend. And the first chart I showed you about the explosion of cross-border data flows, it's really not in keeping with that trend, and possibly cutting off companies and people from the ideas, the opportunities that they need.
Thank you so much for your interesting and thoughtful presentation. My name is Abraham Avidor, formerly with the Foreign Service. Under this new regime, digitized global regime, how are countries supposed to protect themselves from such thing as piracy of intellectual property rights, patents, national security, and so on? Do you think that the power of the Interpol should be increased to include a digitized division to deal with this new development?
I think that's a really interesting idea. I have to say I don't have the answers. I think that more international coordination is definitely needed. And that when you think about hacking and cybercrime, I mean, it is a huge threat to companies and to governments. And I frankly don't know the extent of sharing that goes on. But clearly there is, it always seems like the nefarious uses of these technologies are one step ahead of where the regulators are. So I think it's a huge issue, and whether there needs to be an official, international group, or whether one of the existing ones like the UN or, World Bank or IMF take it on, I think is a critical issue and very important, interesting suggestion for Interpol.
Susan, we had a question come in on Twitter about where the source of your data comes from. Can you speak about where the data for the report comes from?
Well, the data for the report is all from national governments. Telegeography is a source of the cross-border data flows, and then immigration, as well as goods, services, finance, come from a variety of national central banks and statistical agencies, the ILO and the BIS and the IMF. So happy to take that up and get into the arcane details. But if you look at the technical appendix, it's literally compiled. We have data for over 150 countries, the inflows and outflows over time of each of the five. And it is painstaking, but it's all out there, but we have taken the time to piece it together and make sure we've got apples to apples.
I have a data-related question. If you look at the presidential politics and trade, Rachel Pfeffer, Library of Congress. Big fan of your study too, big user. If you look at the presidential politics, a lot of the discussion around trade is look at the trade deficits. Trade deficits don't really show the full extent of trade. They don't show the value add from global supply chains. They always give the example of the iPhone coming from China. They don't show the data flows and necessarily all the services. So given your view as an economist and having dug into all this data, I just wanted to see what ideas or recommendations you would have for better explaining the trade numbers and better capturing what is going on in global trade.
That is a great point. It's a great question, and I'm going to go away and think about it. I mean, on some level, very glibly, I would say trade deficits don't matter. Now, unless you are a poor nation who literally has a balance of payments crisis, trade deficits are completely the wrong thing to look at. In our econometrics on the value of this, we looked at inflows and outflows, and countries benefit from inflows, imports of goods, as well as exporting. How do they benefit? Well, first of all, consumers and companies get the best goods most cheaply, and it enhances competition. So I'll have to think about the right analogy, but looking at an export trade deficit or surplus is absolutely the wrong way to think about globalization. Like I said, unless you are in the category of country who literally has a difficult time paying for the imports, which is certainly not the United States. And I'm hopeful that in future election cycles, as our digital children who have cross-border friends and are more globally aware get older, and as we move into this era where small businesses start to participate more and it's more open to participation by all, maybe we'll move beyond some of this backlash, which is not to minimize, the manufacturing job losses that the U.S. has seen due to automation as well as trade over the last 15 years. But I think our clear view is that that was an event that has happened and is over, that a lot of labor-intensive manufacturing left the United States. That happened. Those jobs aren't coming back. But as we move forward, unlikely to see that kind of mass restructuring simply because labor costs are no longer the driving decision for most types of manufacturing plants. Josh.
Thanks, Susan.
Here, next question.
No, thank you very much. I mean, great report and a great presentation, so thank you. And this information may be in the technical appendix, so I apologise. I haven't got to that part of it. I just wanted a very simple question about the index, and if you could just maybe explain it a little bit more, because there are a couple of data points there which weren't, I think, intuitively obvious, particularly, if you could just elaborate a little bit more on what you're picking up in the data column there. For instance, you wouldn't necessarily think that Germany would be 2 and the US would be 7, and I think it's very interesting that that's like that, and it would be good to understand that a little bit more. And also just a little bit more on the finance side, for instance, again, intuitively, I would not have automatically concluded that China would be higher than the United Kingdom, for instance, on finance, but so just more on how you came out with those numbers.
Yeah, so this looks at the value of inflows and outflows of each type. So goods are straightforward, services are straightforward. Finance includes, cross-border capital flows are highly volatile, particularly since 2007. So that component includes both the annual flow, which for many European countries is negative right now. So you have to wrap your mind around that. A negative inflow means that foreigners are taking money out of your country. And a negative outflow means you are bringing home investments. So because of that, we also in finance include just the overall stock. So it's half of the index is on, half of that component is on the annual flow, and then half is on your total outstanding stock of foreign investment assets and liabilities. And China is so big because it has $3.5 trillion of foreign reserves. It has a huge stock of inward foreign direct investment. And in Europe, as I said, all the annual flows are close to zero or have been negative, as those countries basically the EU has de-integrated financially since the crisis. And then for data flows, that's just pure cross-border used bandwidth. So here, because we're treating European countries individually, they get a little bit of an unfair boost, because if we had New York and California, et cetera, so Germany's getting a big boost by cross-border data flows within Europe as well as with rest of the world. As one of the follow-on studies we're doing that should be out this summer, we're redoing all of this analysis, focusing on Europe and treating the EU 28 as a single block and looking at their connectedness to each other, but then separately their connectedness to the rest of the world, so treating it as if it were like the United States. So, yes, way in the back.
James Sang, you indicated that your $7.8 trillion increase in GDP has a large productivity component to it. Now, there's a crowd of people like Bob Gordon and Syverson and Fernald who are worrying about total factor productivity, which I presume is related to your productivity, and saying that the West, the rich countries, have had a rather slow increase of that. Are you implying that if we removed this new component, that the TFP problem is even worse than it appears?
I would say yes, absolutely. That if we had autarkic nation states, I think TFP problems would be a lot worse, simply because of the lack of competition, the cross-border flow of ideas and innovations. And we can have a long debate about Bob Gordon. I was actually, way back when, as an undergraduate, a research assistant for Bob Gordon and worked on one of the earlier editions of his macroeconomics textbook. But I am still a believer that, in fact, internet technologies are tremendous. Digital technologies are equivalent to, I think it's already equivalent to electricity. We say, well, look, the electric generation portion of GDP is what, 5 or 6%, but no company can operate without electricity. Well, that's like the internet today. The ICT sector of GDP is single-digit, small percent, but no company can operate without digital technologies. And I think that the first wave of internet was very largely consumer-focused, and a lot of those goods, as I mentioned, were free, and we're not measuring them at all, but they create tremendous value. But I think that the next wave is called the industrial internet, the Internet of Things, and its machine-to-machine connections. And there, I think we will start to see it ripple through in TFP as we measure it in national GDP, because you'll see different sectors of the economy start to have productivity boosts. So that's my 2 cents on both those elements.
Right.
Hi.
Thanks, Mike Ferrantino. I found it World Bank. Yes, that's actually important for the setup. So I found very powerful what you were saying about instantaneous flows of data and how they could rapidly speed up the product cycle as compared to what it was when, say, Ray Vernon was talking about it. And we've been wondering for a moment, can I even teach Ray Vernon anymore, if this is true? So here's my question. So suppose in the course of my workday, I'm asked to talk to the industries minister of Sri Lanka, and they say, we've read all these things about rapid flows of data, and we're having a discussion at the cabinet level of starting a national champion in jet aircraft to compete with the US and Europe. And we're going to do that by looking up a bunch of things about jet aircraft on the internet. How should I advise them?
Well, first of all, let me congratulate you, if you were involved, and if not, your colleagues, on the wonderful World Development Report that came out in January, which was exhaustive and insightful and and is great if anyone hasn't read it, about the power of digital and the internet in emerging markets, but taking a very sobering look that it's not a silver bullet, and what do these countries need to do to reap the value. So what should you tell Sri Lanka? Well, first of all, you should say, no national champions. I think we had many decades of learning about the efficacy of those types of policies. So in general, that is typically... Could they do it? I mean, this is the scary thing that we're learning with terrorists as well. Like, yes, actually, you can get the information to do what you need, anything you need to do almost on the internet. So it is, Yes, but I was really going after your national champion for Sri Lanka. I thought you were going to go somewhere else, which is what happens to emerging markets that weren't China and didn't get on the manufacturing bandwagon when global manufacturing trade was soaring. Are they now out of luck?
So, Susan Aronson, GWU. I want to embrace everything that you're saying. I find the data, to use a silly idiomatic expression, compelling. But there's a part of me that is also very concerned both about the productivity things that you mentioned, but also the job loss and the optics and the politics. And I wonder if you could comment on that, because increasingly, I think it's very clear to the educated middle class around the world that not only can their job be outsearched, and I'm going to make these comments myself later, but I'd be curious to hear what you have to say, but they could be replaced by a bot.
Yeah.
So
It is a huge concern everywhere. And I think one of our recommendations was explicitly in manufacturing and goods trade and services trade. Like, I think governments need much better policies really addressing workers that are dislocated by trade and globalization, and realizing that people need help, that it's not enough to say, well, the economy, the overall unemployment rate is at 5%, but there are people who need to have different skills to participate in different industries and maybe in different geographic locations than the small town, that they're living in. And I think that that's incredibly important, and the economic wealth creation from all of this is more than enough to make sure that a piece of that is shared. In terms of the future of work, it's another big set of reports that we're doing around this issue. And it's, we had one report about the automation of knowledge work, which is kind of what you and I do. But here's the good news from that. It's that 40% of tasks of kind of high-end professionals can be automated, will be automated. But that's only 5% of jobs. So we will all, just like, you're an economist, I'm an economist, like I regale my teams with, back in the old day, before we had the internet to do all this, before I had the power, of a mainframe computer on my laptop, it will be, labor enhancing. And part of what we do will be automated away in terms of the sheer number of total jobs likely to be lost. At least, it's a small portion that will be completely done away with. But it's a real issue. John Maynard Keynes was worrying about all of this back in the 1920s and 30s when he was writing. And he has this wonderful essay called The Economic Possibilities of My Grandchildren. And when I do jobs talks, I often start with his quote, and it would seem like it was written by someone today. He was worried about manufacturing assembly lines that were becoming more mechanic and were there going to be any jobs. And at the time he said that economies would be so productive that workers would only have to work 15 hours per week and we would produce all the material goods as a society that we needed. Sometimes we joke and say it was a typo, he meant to write 15 hours per day, but anyway, it's this question of we're getting so technologically advanced, we can provide for global humanity if we want to, but how do people get paid in this world, and what do people do? And all that is to say, I don't have the answer. It's a huge ongoing issue that I think certainly governments need to wake up to. And start thinking about how to deal with large segments of the population that just don't have the right skills to compete anymore. One last question.
My name is Chin Chin. I'm a student here. I think it's a great set of presentation on, kind of like a micro level of which region is growing and each is really going places. But I was wondering if you have more specific research on which industry specific to which region might be underpinning all this growth and connectiveness, or just from your perspective, which region or industry might have a potential to be even more prosperous in the future when it integrates e-trade to its industry?
Yeah, it's a great question about where are the leaders and the laggards. I mean, this index shows you countrywide, but when you look at sectors, we did a report that you can all get on the internet called Digital America, where we just looked at the U.S. economy and we went sector by sector and ranked how digitized is it, meaning what is its investment in digital assets, digital usage to transform processes within the industry, and then enabling workers with IT and other digital tools. And what you find is that, not surprisingly, the high-tech industry itself, ICT and finance and insurance, are the most highly digitized across the board. And then as you go down the rest of the sectors in the economy, you've got hospitality and construction on the bottom. You've got a bunch in the middle, and the point is that overall, the report concludes that the U.S. has captured only 20%, around 20% of the potential of digital technologies. So again, to Bob Gordon's point, there's huge opportunity in every sector of the economy to do more to raise productivity with digital. Apart from like the high-tech industry and maybe finance and insurance, which is out there on the sort of the cutting edge. And then even within each industry, what you find across companies when you look at it, that there are leaders who are out there utilizing digital technologies and laggards. So, and this is in the US, which is arguably one of the most digitized economies in the world. So we're at the very early days of all this. We have only begun to scratch the surface, and like I said, the Internet of Things, machine-to-machine communication, I think we're going to see amazing advances across industries in the years ahead. Okay, well, thank you very much. Interesting, stimulating discussion.